Well, researchers agree that the most effective way to deal with gender-based violence is to make sure that survivors are able to access justice and that perpetrators are prosecuted. But this is where the system often fails. Women cannot easily find safe havens, and protection orders are not properly enforced. There are a number of interventions before Parliament, in fact, to amend the laws relating to the handling of gender-based violence cases. Lawyers for Human Rights will today host a webinar to address some of those issues. And joining us now to unpack the story is Sanja Bornman, who is head of its Gender Equality Program. Sanja, good morning. Thanks very much for your time this morning. You know, as we talk about this issue around access to justice for victims and survivors of gender-based violence, the story of Altisha Korkier in Cape Town comes to mind. That's the woman and her daughter who was stabbed to death in June of this year. And we heard, you know, in the shocking days after their murders, that a week before, she was told by a magistrate in Cape Town to come back next week for a protection order.
Yes, absolutely. Unfortunately, those stories are all too common in the South African story of gender-based violence. And we see this happening not only in courtrooms, but also in police stations and in other places where survivors are meant to be accessing services and care after what they've had to endure.
Yeah, life-saving services, one might add. I mean, these are survivors who, in many, many cases, will tell you that this has been happening for weeks, for months, for years, that I now believe my life is in danger, and this is the point at which I go to the police or I go to a magistrate seeking a protection order.
Absolutely, and I think that this year's 16 days of activism, we should pause and really think about what access to justice means for the people living in South Africa. So we've had a really interesting year in the gender-based violence sector with a lot of increased political will, which is very encouraging. We've seen a range of new laws, bills that will alter some of the existing laws on gender-based violence. And that's all very encouraging. But the real measure at the end of the day is whether the lived experience of survivors is different. And so we need to really think about what access to justice means. It does not mean the same thing for all people.
Let's unpack that for a second there, Sanja. The issue of access to justice. It means access to a lawyer or access to legal advice. What's the reality for most women in South Africa when it comes to being able to access legal advice?
Well, yes, it does mean access to a lawyer and access to legal advice, but it could also mean access to a safe space. It could also mean being able to get a divorce so that you don't have to be married to an abusive spouse anymore. It could also mean having access to social assistance. But when it comes to access to legal advice, so the traditional way in which we understand access to justice in South Africa, women do not have an easy time of it. And just in the previous segment, there was mention of a report which indicates very clearly that especially Black women in South Africa are bearing the brunt of poverty in the country. And this necessarily impacts on a woman's ability to retain, for example, private legal assistance. And so we need to think about legal aid in South Africa and where this legal aid goes to for the most part. And the reality is that the majority of the legal aid budget, unfortunately, is spent on representing folks who are in trouble with the law. And that is correct in terms of our constitution and the rights contained in Section 35. But the reality is that women mostly need assistance with civil law issues, things like domestic violence protection orders, things like access to maintenance, things like family court or divorce court. And so if we are spending the majority of our legal aid budget on criminal matters, where does that leave people who need help with civil law issues? And that is mostly women. And so we find ourselves in a situation where access to legal advice and legal representation is not attainable for a large portion of women in South Africa. And of course, we have organizations like Lawyers for Human Rights, where folks can come for advice and sometimes representation, depending on the nature of the case. But we need to think a lot more sustainably about this. If we all agree that there is a massive gender-based violence problem,